Barbara Tepa Lupack. I'm former academic dean and professor of English at SUNY, and also author or editor of a number of books on film adaptation and silent film, including literary adaptations in Black American cinema, From Michaud to Morrison, Early Race Filmmaking in America, Silent Serial Sensations, The Wharton Brothers and the Magic of Early Cinema, and Richard E. Norman and Early Race Filmmaking. Richard E. Norman is one of my all-time favorite early race filmmakers, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak to you about him, and especially about his landmark 1926 film, The Flying Ace. Like his better-known contemporaries Oscar Michaud and Noble and George Johnson, Norman became one of the most successful and prolific race filmmakers of his time. What is surprising, perhaps, is that Norman was a Southern-born white man, one of a handful of white filmmakers who produced silent films exclusively for race audiences. A savvy marketer, Norman capitalized on the popular fascination with exotic locales and new technologies like automobiles and airplanes, which he incorporated into The Flying Ace and his other films. A zealous self-promoter, he developed exploitation accessories like colorful graphic posters, and he devised elaborate promotions called ballyhoos to draw moviegoers inside the theaters to see his feature films. A fierce independent, he refused to amalgamate with other filmmakers or to seek backing from outside investors in his company, as many perpetually underfunded race filmmakers often tried to do. Instead, he self-financed his films, occasionally attempting creative alternative financing, such as a profit-sharing franchise by which he tried to sell advance shares in his next picture. A businessman and true entrepreneur, Norman became the only early race filmmaker to purchase and operate his own production studio, where he produced The Flying Ace. And after most of his fellow early race filmmakers were forced out of the business by high production costs, poor distribution outlets, and the transition from silent to sound films, Norman found innovative ways to maintain his ties to the film industry. Yet, despite the fact that he was a worthy rival to both Michaud and the Johnson brothers, his contribution to race filmmaking has long been underappreciated. Norman started his career in the film industry as a film developer, a cameraman, and then an independent producer of industrial films. He soon began making home talent moving pictures, that is, very short filmed playlets that featured ordinary citizens in pre-scripted storylines built around stock footage of spectacular events such as car chases and train wrecks, footage he purchased or borrowed from other filmmakers. By 1919, though, Norman was anxious to move on and to move up to the burgeoning business of feature-length films. So he returned to his hometown of Jacksonville, which at the time was one of the early regional centers of modern filmmaking, and was considered the winter film capital of the world. Florida offered filmmakers numerous advantages: good weather, low labor costs, and established transportation routes to both the Northeast and the Midwest. Numerous major motion picture companies, from Kalem to S&A and Vitagraph, had already moved there for seasonal, or in some cases, year-round filming. What most distinguished Norman from those other producers, however, was his decision to make race pictures, which featured all-black casts, were created for black audiences, and were shown almost exclusively in black theaters. Those race films imagined an all-black world, and they spoke directly to the black experience, and reflected black life and achievement in a markedly non-stereotypic way. During his time as an independent traveling producer, Norman had opportunity to observe the crowds of enthusiastic black moviegoers at midnight rambles, and its special showings in theaters where they were forced to sit in segregated balconies. He quickly recognized the financial potential in producing and distributing pictures for such a broad but underrepresented market. "There is no better angle of the motion picture business you can get into for quick returns and sure profit than Negro pictures," he wrote to a colleague. But according to his son, Captain Dick Norman, profit was not his father's sole motivation. Foremost was the desire to improve race relations, to help black performers live up to their full potential and to present blacks in a better and more realistic light. Norman's early feature films anticipated the even greater achievement of his later film, The Flying Ace, and they were notable for several reasons. First was the depiction of the post-war employment opportunities increasingly available to aspiring blacks who had migrated north to work in new and emerging industries such as railways, steel, and transportation. And second was the richness of its characters. Unlike the typical lowbrow comic stereotypes, that is, the ubiquitous mammies, Uncle Toms, and pickaninnies that dominated mainstream film of that era, Norman's characters were solidly middle-class professionals in positions of authority and dignity. Engineers, surveyors, ranchers, policemen, detectives, and doctors. They dressed well, worked hard, and lived in spacious and elegant homes. Black moviegoers who were used to seeing black characters typed by their tattered and exaggerated garb and restricted to roles as domestics and servants in mainstream white films could and did take special pride in such anti-typing. As early as his first race feature, Norman was quick to emphasize in his promotional materials that there is not a white man in the cast, a phrase that he repeated often in describing his later productions as well. Nor, he added, is there depicted in the entire picture anything of the usual mimicry of the Negro. That all-black casting was no doubt the reason even his rival George Johnson described Norman's productions as being among the biggest drawing cards ever played in Negro houses. Norman's early films spanned a variety of genres, including black cast westerns, a pair of which he shot on location in the all-black town of Boley, Oklahoma, a territory of great symbolic importance to early race filmmakers because of the opportunities that the West historically offered to blacks. There, in Boley, he filmed legendary black rodeo and trick riders like Bill Pickett, around whom he built a slim plot about rustlers stealing cattle from an honest rancher. Like so many of his fellow race filmmakers, Norman worked on a very small budget, funding for which came out of his own pocket. That was true throughout his career up to and beyond his phenomenally successful The Flying Ace. For the making of the two westerns a few years earlier, for example, he had budgeted just under $3,000. As production costs mounted, however, he was forced to cut corners, telling his lead actors to bring with them any clothing that might prove suitable for their roles, and even sewing some of the outlaws' costumes himself. To give you a basis for comparison, only a few years later, Carl Laemmle and Harry Pollard filmed a new version of Uncle Tom's Cabin on a budget of $2 million. Clearly, as the numbers confirm, Norman worked on a mere pittance of a budget, which makes his result that much more remarkable. Knowing that his audiences wanted not only black characters, but also interesting action-packed storylines, he gave them lots of on-screen adventure and suspense. Regeneration, an exotic South Seas story, was set on a desert island where the heroine has been stranded by a villain who steals her father's treasure map. That picture was more overtly sexual than Norman's previous films, and certainly more than other race films, a fact that Norman exploited with his colorful posters and lobby cards, which revealed the beautiful female star Stella Mayo naked as she bathed in the waters, although it showed her only in silhouette. It was during the filming of Regeneration that Norman began negotiations to purchase the former Eagle Studios in Jacksonville, a film plant where he could produce, develop, and edit his own pictures. And that brings us directly back to The Flying Ace. With the new studio came new opportunities and new projects, the most significant being a proposed collaboration with Captain Edison C. McVeigh, the self-described king of stunts. A skilled black flyer and one of the world's great aeronautic daredevils, the popular McVeigh advertised himself as the Black Ace, and he drew huge crowds wherever he performed. Both Norman and McVeigh, however, could be stubborn and opinionated, and they had more than their share of misunderstandings and of what we would call today creative differences. So unsurprisingly, the negotiations quickly fell apart. Norman, though, remained committed to the production of a flight picture, and fortunately for him, another opportunity soon arose. Chicago Defender columnist D. Ireland Thomas wrote Norman that Bessie Coleman, who was billed as the only colored girl aviator in the world, and who was a near legendary figure in the black popular culture of her day, was interested in filming a picture about her extraordinary life. Norman contacted her, and a plan for the picture was soon in the works. Given the fascination with Coleman, that picture would surely have been a big hit. But sadly, it never came to be. In late April 1926, Coleman was killed while practicing for an air show to benefit the Negro Welfare League in Jacksonville. She was doing a test flight over the city in preparation for her performance the next day, when the plane she was in pitched and plummeted to the ground, instantly killing Coleman and her mechanic. More determined than ever to produce an aviation film, Norman decided to script his own version, initially titled The Black Ace, and soon retitled The Flying Ace. After contacting and considering many of the top actors of the day, he signed the husband and wife team of Lawrence Kreiner and Catherine Boyd, veterans of the famed Harlem Lafayette Players, one of the best and most distinguished acting companies in New York. That company of players had been founded by stage and vaudeville actress Anita Bush, who herself had starred in both of Norman's early westerns. According to Kreiner's contract, filming of The Flying Ace would begin in June 1926 and be completed in 2 weeks. For his services and for the services of his wife and of 2 supporting actors, Kreiner would be paid a total of $550, with an additional payment of $176 if extra shooting time was required. Even in that day, that was a paltry sum, but black actors had few opportunities to work in white pictures, so they accepted whatever roles they could get in race films, which at least served a social purpose. Just to give you a basis for comparison, Pearl White, the popular white actress and serial star, was in the 1920s earning as much as $3,000 to $5,000 per week for her services. As he had done with the filming of his westerns in the all-black town of Boley, Oklahoma, Norman initially hoped to produce several portions of the film in Christiania, Florida, a fast-growing development advertised as a city for Negroes only. But when that plan didn't work out, he resorted to a different plan and filmed most of the film, even the airplane sequences, on location at the Norman Studios in Jacksonville. A smashing airplane detective mystery done in a smashing way, The Flying Ace was promoted as, quote, a novel colored picture, timely too, coming right on the heels of the death of Bessie Coleman, with stunts in it and thrills that she never attempted or could do, unquote. That was certainly an exaggeration for publicity purposes, since none of the film's stunts was real, and none was filmed in the air. In the picture, Captain Billy Stokes, a combat pilot, hero of World War I and a flying ace, returns from wartime service still wearing his uniform to solve the most baffling case of his career. With the help of his sidekick and mechanic, one-leg Peg, Stokes exonerates the aged station master Thomas Sawtell, who is originally suspected of the theft, rescues Sawtell's daughter Ruth from a fellow aviator who lusts after her and takes her hostage in his plane when she rebuffs his proposal, and exposes the real villains who framed Sawtell for the crime. Peg Reynolds, by the way, was Norman's all-time favorite actor. He appeared in every one of Norman's features, and he was a real favorite with audiences as well. And he was, of course, one of the major stars of The Flying Ace. As you'll see when you watch the film, Peg could do it all, and on just one leg. He could hop a train, pedal a bike, play his wooden limb like a ukulele, and even surprise outlaws by shooting a rifle through it. The story, though, belonged to Captain Stokes. Allow me to pause for a moment. Captain Stokes, black aviator. While that may not seem surprising to us today, we have to remember that in 1926, when Norman produced The Flying Ace, there were no black aviators in the U.S. Armed Services, nor would there be for decades to come. Not until the early 1940s, when the brave Tuskegee Airmen took to the skies and demonstrated their heroism by flying more than 15,000 sorties over Europe and Africa. Black military participation in World War I, in fact, was severely and radically restricted. Blacks were prohibited from serving alongside white soldiers in the army, partly because of ridiculous fears of placing deadly weapons in black hands. They were limited to menial roles in the Navy and excluded entirely from service in the Marines. So by making his hero a decorated black military aviator, Norman was showing not an actual war hero from World War I, but an aspirational figure, someone whom black audiences could admire and hope to be. To give you another historical footnote, in the aftermath of World War I, as black soldiers returned home, they often fell victim to unprovoked white violence. In fact, there are multiple cases reported and recorded of lynchings or shootings of the black veterans, some of them still wearing their military uniforms. By depicting Stokes as a uniformed, returning veteran, Norman was also referencing, albeit a bit obliquely, this shameful, disgraceful American practice. Captain Stokes, however, was not the only non-stereotypical character in the film. There's also another black flyer, Finley Tucker, who also owns his own plane, a black paymaster, and a fearless black heroine, Ruth Sawtelle, who performs daring acrobatic aerial stunts of her own. Some of those characters are laudable, and some are not, particularly the antagonists who are engaged in less than noble activities like bootlegging and theft. But that was precisely Norman's point. The world that Norman and his fellow race filmmakers were creating was an all-black society that mirrored white society in all of its aspects, good and bad, but that spoke directly to black audiences. There was in the early decades of the 20th century tremendous fascination with transportation technologies, railroad trains, submarines, hot air balloons, automobiles. But perhaps the greatest novelty of the era was the airplane. Audiences clamored to see them and to learn more about them. So in his promotions, Norman hyped the aerial aspects of the Flying Ace and even offered details about the making of the film, particularly about the model Curtiss JN-4D, the type of plane that Coleman was flying when she was killed. The symbol of Stokes' heroism, that prop plane, proudly built by Norman himself, was therefore in some ways one of the biggest stars of the film. Captain Dick Norman, who grew up on the studio lot and who, unsurprisingly, eventually became a commercial pilot, recalled some of the stunts that his father employed in filming his stunning aerial scenes, none of which, as I mentioned earlier, was actually shot in the air. As you'll see when you watch the film, those tricks included the use of a fog machine to suggest that the planes were actually flying high up in the clouds. The tricks also included flipping the camera upside down for several of the flight combat scenes. Interestingly, only later did Norman realize that despite the fact that heroine Ruth was theoretically hanging upside down, her hair never moved. Only a few weeks before The Flying Ace was released on September 1st, 1926, Norman admitted that he never would have tackled such an ambitious, mechanical picture had he known the final cost, and he expressed doubt that he would make his investment back. Fortunately, just the opposite was true. The film opened strong and quickly became another box office smasher. Within a month of its release, it had broken house records nationwide, and in Norman's words, had already proven to be the biggest moneymaker for the colored exhibitor this year, bar none. From Austin to Mobile, from Cleveland to Richmond, it played to what Norman called capacity plus, with even standing room only patrons being turned away. Single-day box office receipts typically ran into the hundreds of dollars. Interest in the film was so keen that at times both Norman and his hired roadman worked separate routes, showing it simultaneously throughout the South and the Midwest. Demand for the picture continued for almost a decade, during which time, according to the Norman Studios records, it grossed over $20,000, a phenomenal amount for that day. But perhaps the greatest testament to the novelty of The Flying Ace was not its box office numbers or its longevity, but rather its success in showing blacks in roles that they should have had, but in reality were denied. That notion of racial access and racial uplift, the promise of advancement through individual achievement, was central to Norman's film and consistent with contemporary black ideology. His heroes and heroines confirmed that blacks, given access and given opportunity, not only could but also would succeed and make vital contributions to American life. They weren't mammies or Uncle Toms, Jezebels or Bucks. They were, as in real life, bright, ambitious, and industrious figures. Making high-quality race pictures was one thing. Distributing them so audiences could see them was another. By the time he produced The Flying Ace, Norman had established strong and enduring contacts with many theater owners, and he kept extensive and meticulous notes that allowed him to maximize those relationships. He knew, for example, the race, religion, and ethnicity of the owner or the manager, and often the names and ages of their children as well. He knew if they enjoyed vaudeville, if they had local bands available to play for the films, and even if they did good business at their concession stands. He also knew the names of competing theaters and the prices that they paid for film rentals, which helped him in negotiating prices for the rentals of his own films. and he was keenly aware of the quality of the film projectors, since a poor projector could tear up a print. That was extremely important information, since at any given time Norman had only 1 or 2 working prints, because he could not afford to make extras. To distribute the Flying Ace, Norman established so-called circuits. That is, a lineup of cities where he could exhibit those films at top dollar. A good circuit started and ended in his home state of Florida, usually with a loop through 1 or 2 or even 3 other southern states. That practice was known as road showing, and it was exactly what it sounds like, a tedious process by which early race filmmakers literally took to the road to exhibit their pictures. By contrast, most mainstream producers had distribution agencies or outlets that performed that particular function for them. They could wrap a film, take it to the distributor, get an advance, and start a new picture right away, a luxury that race filmmakers simply did not have. Instead, Norman often hand-carried his prints, personally delivering them town by town, city by city, theater by theater, sometimes traveling by car, sometimes by bus or train, and on rare occasions even on foot. Norman's most lucrative Flying Ace exhibitions typically occurred when he brought with him the film stars, Kreiner and Boyd, to enact a dramatic reading before the show. And an even bigger draw was the versatile and singular one-legged Steve Peg Reynolds, who would perform an exciting ballyhoo in which he recreated some of his amazing stunts from the films, such as riding a bicycle, shooting villains through his wooden leg. Peg would also take his bally directly to the so-called colored quarters, where he would go through several costume changes and vaudeville skits, sometimes for as long as 15 to 30 minutes. Those skits, Norman wrote to one exhibitor, boosted business greatly by getting people out of their homes and into the theaters. With or without the support of Kreiner, Boyd, and Reynolds, the Flying Ace elicited an overwhelmingly favorable response. Yet while audiences found the Flying Ace to be thrilling, white censor boards took issue with certain scenes and subjects. The Pennsylvania State Board of Censors, for example, objected to the depiction of drugs and to the representation of criminal violence by blacks. The State of New York's Motion Picture Division likewise objected to the theft and violence for fear that it would incite black patrons to engage in similar criminal acts against whites. Yet notably, films like The Birth of a Nation in 1915, which had depicted gruesome and graphic violence perpetrated by whites against blacks, faced virtually little criticism from white censor boards. After The Flying Ace, Norman produced only one more film, Black Gold, about ranchers in the Oklahoma Territory who strike oil on their properties, and about the crooks who try to steal their land to claim the oil rights. Black Gold was supposed to be the first of what Norman called a series of true stories of living colored examples showing their dramatic rise to leadership and wealth against overwhelming odds. Such a series, he believed, would, as his Flying Ace had so successfully done, inspire ambition in members of the race. Instead, it became his last feature film. With the landscape of the industry quickly shifting, Norman found himself in competition not simply with other producers of black silent films, but also with the Hollywood studios and the new technology of sound film, which was already revolutionizing the industry. And in the wake of the recent flu pandemics and with the advent of the Great Depression, black theaters, always Norman's primary and largest clientele, were closing, making distribution more problematic than ever. Sadly, a situation not so different from the one we're experiencing in these days of pandemic. Over the next few years, Norman tried to stay in the film business in several ways. By continuing to roadshow his silent films at lesser venues, such as schools and churches, by exhibiting fight films that white theaters were reluctant to show, featuring Joe Louis the Brown Bomber, a proud role model for black youth just as McVeigh and Bessie Coleman had been, and eventually by purchasing his own motion picture house, the so-called Famous Theater for Colored in Winter Park, Florida. When he died in Jacksonville in late 1960, his death brought to a close a remarkable but underappreciated career. Today, more than a century after Norman produced his first race film, he is finally being recognized for his vital role in early American cinema. The Flying Ace, his best known and only complete extant film, remains a high point of early race filmmaking, not just for its innovation and technical excellence, but for its exceptional portrait of black life and black ambition. So this is what I hope to leave you with. The fact that Norman, like his fellow race filmmakers, was determined to give his audience the role models that they craved but never saw in mainstream studio production. In his 7 race films, and especially in The Flying Ace, he distinguished himself by reversing the old stereotypes, by celebrating black accomplishment, and by creating new visual imagery. Despite disadvantages in funding and in distribution outlets and regular battles with censors, Norman proved himself to be progressive in his thinking and in his filmmaking. He rejected negative stereotypes and elevated his female characters like Ruth Sawtelle in The Flying Ace, making them integral to his plots, not mere adjuncts to the action. So while the early race film phenomenon was short, Norman nevertheless blazed new social and cinematic trails. His work was essential to the imagination and depiction of new roles that blacks could assume in society and in the emerging fight for civil rights in this country and in the history and sociology of the Great Migration. Like his fellow early race filmmakers, Norman made a change in how movie producers viewed black moviegoers, and perhaps more importantly, in how blacks viewed themselves in the transition to modern urban life. His race pictures provided a visual space for black members of society, in opposition to white cinema's racial politics and on-screen racist portrayals. The Flying Ace was not only one of the best race films ever produced in the silent era, it was also lots of fun to watch. I hope that you'll agree. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your interest in Richard E. Norman and his landmark film, The Flying Ace. And thank you for your participation in this Finger Lakes Film Trail program series sponsored by Humanities New York.